morning, Warsaw. Today is Sunday, 20th August. It will be fine but cloudy in the evening with highs of 23 degrees Celsius or 73 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:43 a.m. and sunset at 8:07 p.m. We are on the 20th day of the Warsaw Uprising and the insurgents have a huge success on this day. I know Alina is dying to tell us all about it. However, there are other things happening as well. What are they?
Do you know what, Philippe? I've decided I'm going to start with the pasta building capture because it is definitely one of my favourite actions during the Warsaw Uprising. Let's start with the beginning. What is the pasta building? It's the Polish stock telephone company, and this day is the day that it goes down in history, thanks to one of the greatest successes that the insurgents did during the Warsaw Uprising. So this building is made of reinforced concrete. It resembles a medieval castle tower located on Jelena Street. And when it was completed in 1908, it was known as the tallest building in the Russian Empire and the tallest residential structure in Europe. So it had about 11 floors, and during the war, during the occupation, the German occupation, the building was strategically important. It was serving as a communication hub for German troops at the rear of the Eastern Front, and it was one of the city's 6 telephone exchanges. We did talk about that earlier. I did mention the Little Pasta building. I talked about the attempted capture of that, and that was located here, and the military telephone exchange that served the Wehrmacht units in Warsaw ran straight through it. So this was a very important strategic point for the Germans, and no wonder they were defending the building and they were determined to hold on to it. The German crew consists of 157 people, including 7 officers, and the assault by the insurgents on this building takes place on the night of August 19th to the 20th, and it lasts practically all day of the 20th of August, which is today. So let's talk about the insurgents. The insurgent unit consists of 250 soldiers from the Koniecki battalion, an assault platoon, 2 sapper patrols, a women's mining patrol, 2 flamethrower patrols, and a brigade unit. So this is an extremely large amount of insurgents and use of weapons and ammunition that's being put forward to capture this building. The attack of the insurgents actually began at 2:30 in the morning with an explosion destroying the wall of a neighbouring building. And then a footbridge was built over the rubble, and about a dozen or so insurgents with flamethrowers entered the building. But nothing came out of this because the Poles were basically driven out by the Germans. They had an advantage over the insurgents at this stage. So this attack at this point fails. But this is not the end, because at the same time there is an attack happening at the back of the building. So we've got from the side and from the back at the same time. But this is an explosion, a charge explosion containing 23 kilograms of plastic. Unfortunately, this causes the entire wall to collapse, making it impossible to get into the building, into the ground floor. So again, another failure. So far, 2 failures, but I promise you we will get to the success of this building. The breakthrough in this fight comes when the building is set on fire. The insurgents use a motorised pump, and they pump in a mixture of oil and gasoline into the building at about 7:30 in the morning, and they set fire to it by a Piat grenade launcher. The Germans at the beginning managed to control the fire. However, the insurgents managed to also enter the building from the side and set the outbuilding on fire. So we've got fire that the Germans are trying to control and fire that is also raging where they can't control it. The insurgents then breach the main gate. Assault troops enter from the main part of on Jelena Street, and about approximately 12 o'clock, so nearly 5.5 hours later, the insurgents pump nearly 1,000 litres of flammable substances into the second floor of the building. Basically, they're trying to douse the tower in flammable liquid so that it could just be set alight. The insurgents kept the fire going with flamethrowers, and what's really interesting, Claire will talk about it in a minute, but you can see photograph evidence of these flamethrowers, of these insurgents with flamethrowers. It's absolutely incredible. Groups of Germans desperately tried to escape from the burning building, but the insurgents managed to thwart their escape attempts. There was a success with an assault platoon which broke through the breaches in the walls, and then they managed to continue the fighting in the corridors, the staircases, and in various different corners of the building, which were filled with clouds of smoke and fire. I just couldn't imagine imagine the state that these insurgents are fighting in. The German crew that was left behind tried to save themselves from the burning fire and the attacking insurgents by retreating into the basement of a building. The insurgents then entered the basement of the building and captured the remaining German crew that were trying to save themselves. They managed to capture a huge cascade of weapons and ammunition, including a heavy machine gun, several light machine guns, an anti-tank gun, and about 50 submachine guns. And they also managed to liberate a group of Polish hostages that were kept in the basement. 35 Poles died in the attempt to capture the building, and the Germans lost 36 people. And in total, 121 enemy soldiers were captured. It was an incredible action by the insurgents, and this just vibrated throughout the whole of Warsaw amongst all of the insurgents. They finally captured an impossible building to capture, and the euphoria and the happiness and the morale of the people and the insurgents was skyrocketing high at this stage.
Let's just take a step back. This Pasta building, it's a very iconic building in Warsaw because it's so high, so well known, very famous building. And why is the capture of this so important? Probably two reasons. One is it's very well known because this is one of the battles that is filmed by the reporters, the Poles that are going out with cameras to record for posterity the successes and the traumas of the uprising. And this is one of the biggest successes of the Warsaw Uprising. And because it's filmed, it has become incredibly famous. These pictures of the billowing clouds of black smoke choking out across the rest of the city, the flames coming out through the first and second floor windows and so on. And it was an attack that lasted over 12 hours. We're talking about 13, 14 hours. So they get it's a whole epic drama, if you like, but it's also strategically important as well to capture this building, isn't it? So the height of the building, you mentioned, Alina, the German snipers at the top of it. Well, now their places are taken by Polish lookouts who are able to constantly observe the surrounding German positions in that area. And it's a huge propaganda victory as well. To capture this vast, important building gave a lot of hope to the insurgents and to the civilians in Warsaw as well. I think the belief was, surely if the uprising forces could take the Pasta building, then they could take the rest of the city. It bolstered hope that the uprising could yet be successful. So it really boosted the morale and the mood of the people. And that building as well, the Pasta building, remained in Polish hands until right up to the end of the Warsaw Uprising. But I think the other reason it's so important is because of the numbers of the German fighters who were captured and had to be looked after, sent to prisoner of war camps. And I think that's something that we haven't really looked at enough so far, is it? So obviously, there was a massive capture of prisoners in the first day of the uprising when the Home Army had that element of surprise. And then there are moments like the capture of the Pasta building today on day 20. But what's happening to the enemy forces? Roger, where are the Germans being kept?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's reckoned that the Poles captured as many as 2,000 German soldiers during the rising, during the 63 days of the rising. And they had to be processed. I mean, those that were injured were treated duly. They had to be processed. So they had a sort of broad segregation of those prisoners. So that ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers were one category. They also had those that were members of the SS or police battalions and so on. Those that were suspected of having committed atrocities as well was another category. And they would be interrogated. Those that were suspected of having been complicit, atrocities against the Polish people were duly interrogated with a view to a future prosecution. So it's all very correct. The way those POWs are treated. So in line with international law, those prisoners could be obliged to work, and they were generally used for sort of what we might call sappers' work, sort of repairing barricades and making fortifications and so on, but also some heavy labour such as digging wells and transportation, that sort of thing. In some instances, they were also used for more dangerous work, such as disarming unexploded ordnance in the city, which is, I think, less legally justifiable, but nonetheless was the case. Go on.
May I just jump in a little bit there? It's interesting, isn't it, that the Home Army is, like you said, trying to process these people according to law as far as possible. And there may be, I think we could contend some of the things that they were making them do, getting rid of ordnance, but they were more or less trying to work under the Geneva Convention, playing by the rules. The same can't be said on the other side of things. The Germans, we have the use of human shields, we have the murder under order, the murder of civilians. But also what's really interesting is that the Germans have, of course, signed the Geneva Convention. So have the Poles. The Russians haven't, so that's irrelevant to them. But the Home Army, as opposed to the Polish armed forces overseas, the Home Army isn't at this point legally recognised as an army under the Geneva Convention. So they don't have that status, which means that they are, in acting this way and complying as far as possible, they are positioning themselves to get that legal recognition. Also, they don't have the protections that come with that.
No, that's true. They don't have the protections. But it's interesting that they certainly, even though, as you say, they don't have that status, they importantly view themselves as the sort of the military arm of the government in exile in London. So they see themselves as a legitimate army.
Yeah, absolutely. They call themselves the Home Army. That use of the word army is to distinguish them from the overseas armed forces. They are presenting themselves as the same. And actually, the men in the Home Army have rank and they have, the same sort of disciplinary procedures and all the rest of it. So they absolutely are. And by the end of the Warsaw Uprising, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, they do gain that status. It's a really important part of the support that the international community can give them, is to ensure that they have that status. But at this stage, they don't. And it's just worth mentioning that the Germans see them as partisans at best, as commandos. They're bandits, they'll come under the commando order, and they don't have to be merciful in that way under law. Whereas, although they themselves don't have that status, they are doing all they can, as you say, to play by the rules. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a couple of examples actually that sort of throw that into that difference into a sort of sharp relief. There's one interesting case where a number of German POWs that were taken by the Poles. There was an exchange was suggested for Polish POWs, and when that sort of came to take place, it duly happened, i.e. both sides kind of respected the other. There was no attempt at an ambush or anything like that, and the exchange duly took place. But there's another one which I think is even more telling, which is that we know that the Germans often use sort of human shields using civilians to sort of position them in front of the tanks and so on, so that they can't be fired on, and they tended to do that quite routinely in Warsaw. And there's one instance where, on a particular barricade, a Major Kozakiewicz of the Polish Underground Army, in response to one of these attacks, he put a number of German POWs up against the front of the barricade to sort of show, well, if you're going to not play by the rules, then we won't play by the rules either. And it did, of course, force a halt to what the Germans were doing. So, there's this element of the morality of war. And sort of overstepping the legal lines was one that comes up a lot, and I think that's quite a telling example of the Poles sort of saying, we are playing by the rules, but we don't have to if you don't either.
There's also some really interesting examples of both sides being gentlemanly. So, for example, there have been ceasefires. This will be a little bit later, but there were ceasefires where the Poles were allowed to go and collect their dead, and the Germans went and collected their dead. And it was all very peaceful, very quiet, very easygoing. And both sides honoured the ceasefire.
It's really important to mention that the Poles did, at least on one occasion, use German prisoners of war as human shields, and it's really important that that is included in this pod. There are still differences because the Germans are using civilians, civilian women and children as human shields in front of tanks. Obviously, the Poles didn't have access to German civilians and children, but it is still a difference that needs to be recognised. So, Alina, you kicked off talking about the Pasta Building, which is one of the great successes, really, of the insurgents during the Warsaw Uprising. But on the 20th of August, there were also some terrible losses and terrible strategic losses as well, weren't there?
Yes, this was... it's discussed amongst historians as a huge tactical mistake that was made by the Poles. The insurgents were to attack the Gdańsk railway station. We've spoken about it before, but just to remind our listeners, it's in the northern part of the city. The station right between the Żoliborz district and the Old Town. And this is a major strategic point for the insurgents because the panzer train would be driving up and down those railway tracks. So if they managed to destroy Gdańsk railway station, then that would have been a little bit helpful for them. But anyway, so the insurgents attack on the night of August the 20th and the 21st, and the attacks are carried out by the soldiers of the Campinos Forest, the one we've spoken about before, in the northwestern part of Warsaw. And the problem here is that those troops are not provided with sufficient support from the Żoliborz troops who are supposed to be helping them. The Poles ended up storming a 600-metre long corridor of buildings with fire from the German troops. Now, they were sitting in positions in tenement houses on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. They were also manning artillery batteries, which were located slightly north of them. At midnight on this day, the units of the Campinos group had about 750 soldiers. They began their assault on Gdańsk railway station. And just before the operation began, this is another problem that the insurgents faced. The Germans burnt down the street that they were coming down, which literally illuminated the whole area, which meant the insurgents didn't have the element of surprise. They also lost the cover of darkness, and there was no cover for them to be able to take. And they were being shot at from 3 different sides. The Poles were forced to retreat. They lost about 100 people who were killed and many more wounded. But the fights for Gdańsk railway station would continue. This is not the end. So we have a success and a failure of the uprising today, on this day. But I think we should round off with what's happening with the Germans. Roger, what have you got on that?
Yes, I've been following this diary of Obergruppenführer Erich von den Bach-Zelewski, who's the senior commander of German troops in Warsaw at this time. And he's been increasingly sort of pessimistic and negative about what's going on, how he feels that the strength of the Polish resistance seems to be increasing, and they're making fewer and fewer incursions against that. On the 20th of August, he actually makes a diary entry where he says that his own life was almost at risk. He says that we got lost in the streets of Warsaw and we almost ran into the enemy. Luckily, he said, my instinct warned me in time, but while turning back, we came under fire from Polish sharpshooters. Referring to that sort of crisis of confidence that he was having, he also says later in the same entry, he says, my nerves are healthier now than before, because there is nothing more terrible than having to act against your inner conviction. My conscience must be clear, otherwise I cannot fight. Others may explain this as weakness, but ultimately you have to come to terms with your God yourself. So a sort of peculiar expression of arch morality from a senior SS officer, which is rather interesting. It's interesting also that there was a next report in the log is from an SS Hauptsturmführer, which is sort of rather more junior officer, who writes that he commands one of the Einsatzgruppen, so one of these groups that are sort of going around not only doing the executions but also dealing with the aftermath. And he records the fact that they burned the bodies of 336 victims of execution on that particular day. So much for that morality that von den Bach was talking about. But it is an interesting point. There is an element, a strong element in this, where the SS and members of it, they don't sort of operate by their own principles. At least they don't operate in a moral vacuum. They perceive themselves as doing a dirty job, which is necessary and which is, crucial for Germany, and that they'll never be rewarded for. But, this is nonetheless an important job. And this was expressed most succinctly, I suppose, by this famous, what's known as the Poznan speech of Heinrich Himmler, which was made in October 1943. Which was a speech made to senior SS officers where he referenced, and this is on record, it's one of the few sort of on-record references to the Holocaust, where he says that the Holocaust, i.e. the extermination of European Jewry, was one of the great chapters of German history. But he says it's a chapter that will never be written. So you can see that they are quietly proud of what they're doing. They see it as a necessary evil.
And we have that whole diary entry of Erich von den Bach right here for you guys just to have a listen.
Yesterday, while driving to the command post of Major General Rohr, we got lost in the streets of Warsaw and almost ran into the enemy. My instinct warned me in time. While turning back, we came under fire from Polish sharpshooters. Today, I was again at the front, where the fighting unfortunately stopped. In the afternoon, I was visited by a Polish archbishop, Antoni Sklagowski, who would like to act as a parliamentarian to save the Polish civilian population. Success is very doubtful, because the Polish command of the uprising is not willing to negotiate. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler this time gave me all the powers, as well as the relevant territorial and new army, so for the first time I can act according to my own sense. This means, despite all the ruthlessness, not to fight more bloodily than necessary and to save women and children. So my nerves are healthier now than before, because there is nothing more terrible than having to act against your inner conviction. My conscience must be clear, otherwise I cannot fight. Others may explain it as weakness, but ultimately you have to come to terms with your God yourself.
Thank you so much for joining us on day 20 of the Warsaw Uprising. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for all of your amazing reviews. It's really helping us boost the podcast. Also, if you can, feel free to share with friends or anybody you think would be interested. Again, I'm looking for more American listeners. The Brits are up and we have about 50% of our listeners are British, which is absolutely amazing in itself. But let's get those Canadians, Americans, South Africans, Australians, Irish, and anybody else who you think will be interested. It will be great. So we will see you tomorrow for day 21.